Well, all right. So let's talk about chapter 7, which we've already talked a little bit about. And so there's this argument for hard determinism. And most of this chapter deals with, let me share my screen, a particular argument for hard determinism. And share screen. I need to open it. I'm sorry. Here we go. Now share screen. So if I scroll down here, there's this Galen Strawson's argument for hard determinism, or what this chapter is calling hard incompatibilism, because it's trying to be indifferent between the two ways in which you might reject free will, right? One way is that determinism is true and that rules out free will. And the other way is, even if determinism was false, it would just be random, and that's not free either. So this book starts calling it hard incompatibilism at some point. But basically, it's just a name for rejecting free will. I'll keep calling it hard determinism. And the argument goes, just to remind us of how it works. Premise 1, you act as you do because of your character, right? If you're doing something and you're responsible for it, or if you're doing something, it has to come from you, right? The things you do, for you to be doing them, it has to come from who you are in your character. Premise 2, if you were truly responsible for an act, you'd have to be responsible for the character that led to it. I think that if I was a compatibilist, I'd be rejecting premise 2. If I was a libertarian, I'd be rejecting premise 1. I think libertarians mostly just reject character, right? What you do is a product of your just totally free choice. It's not determined by your character. It just comes from this completely free choice you make. And then premise 2, I think the compatibilist rejects, because they're going to say, you don't have to be responsible for your character. However, you got the way you are. This is who you are, and you're responsible from what comes from who you are, right? So if you cheat on all of your significant others and lie to them and cover it up and hurt them, even if that comes from your genetics and your upbringing and bad examples as a child, however, that might have made you into a certain person who doesn't respect other people's choices and their feelings and their emotions and the harm you're doing to them. But even if you're not responsible for making yourself into that sort of person, you're still responsible for who you are and what comes from who you are. So I think compatibilist rejects premise 2. But again, premise 1, you act as you do because of your character. Premise 2, if you're truly responsible for an act, you'd have to be responsible for the character that led to it. Premise 3, but if you're truly responsible for your character, you had to be responsible for a past act that played a role in making you that way, right? So if you're responsible for what comes from your character, you had to make your character, which means there had to be a previous choice or action you did that shaped your character. But then that would have had to come from an earlier character, which led you to shape your character, to make the choice to shape your character or change who you are. But that would have come from an earlier character, which then you would have also had to be responsible for. So then there would have had to be an earlier act. And that keeps going back and back and back until we get to you being an infant or a very young child. And ultimately, you had to have this original character that made you a certain way and also determined whether you were going to make the choices to shape your character differently, right? So you might say something like, well, even if you had this character, you didn't realize you're a bad person and change or try to shape things to make it different. But even that choice to change your character or to recognize that you needed to change or be motivated to do that had to come from prior character that led you to notice these things and want to change and be motivated to change. And so at some point you had to have this base character that you're not responsible for, that was just given to you by your genetics, your upbringing, the environment. And that's your sort of starting character that you didn't make. And then, and that, according to Galen Strawson's argument, I guess here for hard determinism, is the fundamental problem with believing in free will, because it starts with this base character that you're not responsible for. And so if you're not responsible for your character, you're not responsible for your actions. And so you're not responsible for your actions, and free will doesn't exist. Again, I think the compatibilist rejects premise 2 and the libertarian rejects premise 1. What do we think of this argument? Do we think that this is a successful argument for hard determinism? Do we buy the libertarians' rejection of premise 1, the compatibilist rejection of premise 2? Nicholas, are you talking? Maybe not. Jackson, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking like about the first argument. This is obviously a rather unscientific example, but we often mention how people act out of character in some cases.
Sure.
And I think
I
that's
think
more
that
of
well, there's an
a,
interesting way in which I think the compatibilist has to say that never happens, but go ahead.
I was gonna say a sort of wiggle room libertarian would not necessarily reject character, but would certainly reject um
Yeah.
argument premise one.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know what? I sort of spoke. I tried to simplify things, but you're totally right. You could be a wiggle room libertarian. Also, by the way, really nice introduct. Like I really love that term you just introduced, wiggle room libertarian. Right, the libertarian who thinks maybe you've got a character that kind of tempts you in a certain direction and pressures you in a certain way, but you still have the wiggle room to choose differently. I think that's right. For a libertarian, character doesn't determine what you do. It can sort of pressure you or tempt you or maybe set you up in a certain direction, but you can still either do some wiggle room or you can kind of choose against it. So you're right. That's, I think, the more sophisticated way to think about it. The simpler way to think about it is just to say that the libertarian is rejecting character altogether. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I think I think I was just kind of oversimplifying things to make it easier. What do I want to say here? I mean, in some sense, one way to think about character for the libertarian, one is either it pressures you in a certain way. So you're the sort of person who, I don't know, you have an addictive personality. So it really kind of pressures you to, like, you start to drink or start to smoke and it's really hard for you to quit. It doesn't mean that you can't choose. It doesn't mean you don't have the wiggle room to choose against it, but it does make it harder to make that choice. That's one way in which a libertarian could allow for character, but not have character determine your choices. Another way in which a libertarian could think of character as just kind of an after the fact classification of who you are, right? You choose, no one's a liar. Being a liar doesn't make you lie. But if you choose to lie over and over and over again, I can say after the fact you're a liar, but you made your character through your choices as opposed to your character generating your choices. So it's the character is sort of an after the fact classification of the type of person you are because of your choices, as opposed to the other way of thinking of character, which is the thing that's causing your choices. I guess I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just I'm agreeing with you and going with you on your more complicated discussion of libertarian character.
Professor,
Sure, go ahead.
what's the like, what do they point to as like the starting point for like the character development? Because like this sounds kind of like the abortion like argument for consciousness, like where it really begins, and then because it seems like there's no way to, I don't think there is a way to point to it, and if there's not, then to me it seems like a little weird to.
Well, I think that I don't think they take a stance on this. They remain agnostic as to where the beginning. I mean, so why do you think that they have to be able to tell you how? I mean, I don't. The argument is there has to be a starting point character which starts generating your initial choices and even your choices to change your character. You had to have a starting character, and can't they say, you know, it probably comes from your environment, your genetics, your upbringing, but like at some point there has to, in the same way you might want to argue that there has to be a beginning of the universe or something, right? There has to be some point where you start and you have a character. And I don't know where that is. I don't, like, they don't have to take I mean, if we want to settle abortion, we do need to settle that question, right? Because that matters to when it counts as killing somebody. Like, when do you start? Because we need to know when the line is and why the line's there, so we know when it's murder to kill somebody. But I don't think they have to actually tell us exactly where it's happening for this argument to work, because they can just say there has to be some starting point. I think that's the argument.
This could be like, this is the starting point for when you're responsible for killing somebody. Like, when, like, at what point did this development go down a path where like maybe you could have stopped it, or like it's seen that somebody else's or outside influences made it to the point where like it's not your fault.
What? But look, I mean, think about this the way that, so let's say that let's take that first point. You've got a character. and I'm holding you responsible for the actions that come from that character, right? This is very like whatever the earliest starting point is. Where did that first character come from? Did you choose to have it?
No, I mean it depends on where it's at. Like, but I mean, if you're like a child, I mean, you make choices, but a lot of the choices are made by like your parents or whoever raises you, and then.
Yeah, I mean, this argument, think about wherever that first character is, wherever we say this is where you started to exist, this is where you had enough of your own individual character, like this is where you started, like we start thinking that your actions are coming from you. The worry is you can't be responsible for that initial character, because to be responsible for it, you would have had to have character before it, which led you to choose to have this character. But then that wouldn't have been the first point. Right.
Yeah, but I thought like after that is when you're like able to make decisions.
Yes. You're able to make decisions based on your character, and your decisions to change your character or shape it would have been all originating from that first character you're not responsible for. And the worry is, so even your choices to change your character are things that trace back to this initial character you're not responsible for.
All right. So no responsibility at all.
I mean, this is an argument for hard determinism. That's what this is trying to argue for. Julia, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. Like, I understand what Nico is saying in the sense that it's weird, I think, from our perspective, to not make this delineation, because most of us in society are not hard determinists. Like, we take for granted that very young children, like a 2-year-old, doesn't hold responsibility for, I don't know. How could a 2-year-old even harm someone by accident? Like times when people leave their guns out and kids play
that's
with
pretty
them.
common, actually.
Yeah. Yay, America. First world problems. But so like we don't hold a 2-year-old responsible in the same way that we hold, an 18-year-old or like a 50-year-old responsible. But exactly what you said, that is the whole argument behind hard determinism, right? Is that none of those people should be held responsible, because the 18-year-old is just the 2-year-old further along with more inputs and stimuli. But everything has guided their path to being that 18-year-old. So there's no way that they could have chosen to do otherwise. And I thought watching those videos you linked was really interesting, with the whole like restorative versus retributive justice models. Because as an American, it is so hard for me to wrap my head around complete restorative justice, and this sort of hard determinist argument that like people really could not have done differently. But I see, I in terms of like the arguments, in terms of the sequence of arguments, I think it is pretty airtight from a determinist perspective, the 5 that are presented here.
I think that if we were to become hard determinists, or what the hard determinists want to do with our judicial system is you take the way we treat 10-year-olds, right? When you try someone as a child and you don't really blame them and you're just trying to fix, and you just treat everybody like that, even if you're 50 years old, like everybody's really just like the right attitude towards criminals is the attitude we have towards 8-year-olds who are on trial. And we're wrong to make this switch. Like when you try someone as an adult, that's the mistake America's making, that we're all just products of our environment and not really responsible for what we're doing, and we need to be helped, etc., not punished.
Professor.
Go ahead.
When we say like we're just products of our environment, like that doesn't like just negate all responsibility. It might take it off the person, but like there still points to like something is held responsible. You know what I mean?
Something's held responsible. So so there's these two senses of, so responsibility is this ambiguous word, right? So in some sense, what's responsible for the fire? Well, what would be something? The water heater malfunctioned and it sparked the fire, which burned down the house, right? When we talk about responsibility, when we talk about free will, and like we don't arrest the house. Same thing with animals, right? We don't arrest the alligator. Like we're not holding, when we talk about responsibility.
Yeah, with alligators.
Prison system. Yeah, but we don't, it's not like, well, I need to lock this alligator up and make it feel pain to hold it to hold it responsible for what it did, right? It needs to suffer we don't treat animals that way. We also don't treat houses. I mean, everything else in the universe other than other people, we seem to think that there's this other type of responsibility, this deeper responsibility where you can deserve punishment, right? And that's the thing that the hard determinist is rejecting. He thinks that we should treat everybody just like alligators, right? You're like, well, this person had a bad upbringing and they didn't understand. I mean, like they're not responsible in a sense that requires retributivist punishment. They require quarantining, like to keep other people safe. They require rehabilitation, but they don't require, I think a hard determinist would say, Hitler had a bad upbringing and he did a bunch of bad stuff because of it, but we should lock him up and, hopefully rehabilitate him, and then we can release him back into society, and he can, we don't need to punish him. Maybe if we have to lock him up forever because he's just too far gone just to keep people safe. But there's a different attitude to have towards Hitler, which is that he's a dirtbag piece of shit that we should torture to death very slowly, like pull his fingers off one by one. So that's a different sort of attitude than we treat towards alligators, right? Like that you think that you're holding people responsible for their choices and as if they deserve punishment for their wrongdoings. That's the thing I think the hard determinist is trying to reject. Tema, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I feel like the difference between like the punishment or the rehabilitative punishment for like an alligator versus a kid is for the 2-year-old who accidentally shoots a gun, like we teach lessons to them, like we don't just quarantine them, like we create this educational system to bring them into a world where responsibility exists, so that they're prepared for later having to deal with responsibility. So I think it's hard for me to personally grasp this system where people aren't eventually being educated to deal with possible responsibility.
I agree with you in some. One thing that scares me about hard determinism is this. I find this idea of not thinking of myself as responsible as dehumanizing. To think of myself as an alligator, to think of other people as I treat when a dog urinates on the floor, I don't blame it. I just try to train the behavior out of it. And you're not really punishing it, right? If you hit it on its head, or you don't feed it, or you put it outside, or like whatever you do to it to try training its behavior, you're just trying to train the behavior out of it. It's not like you feel like it's made this, it knew that this was wrong and it chose to do it because it doesn't respect you and doesn't care about like the harm it's doing, and it chose to do something wrong for its own self-interest or selfish reasons. That's not what a dog is doing. A dog is just living it, like it has no idea what's going on. Whereas we treat ourselves and other human beings, we hold ourselves to a different standard. We think that people are in control and people are responsible in this deeper way, and they are deserving of punishment. When someone, I should have, Julia, you mentioned the videos I assigned about these Norway prisons. Now that I think about it, I should have assigned a short 5-minute video that just describes some horrific crime by a very normal, like some dude who was raped, like that guy in Texas who raped, he was very rich. He comes from a rich family. He's a douchebag, and he found some unconscious girl outside of a frat party, and he raped her while she was unconscious. And then he went to court over this, and he got off with 6 months of probation because his parents are rich. And his lawyer's argument was, well, he was super rich, and so he doesn't really think of himself as he thinks that he's above the law. And this was the excuse, right? Like that. Well,
sorry to interrupt.
Sorry. Yeah.
No. Like, the magnitude of your example is good, but I think you're conflating two things. There was a teen who got off on an affluenza argument about being too rich and out of touch after he drunk drove and killed people. And then there was Brock Turner, who was a swimmer at Stanford University in California, who raped a woman behind a dumpster and was given a very light sentence, partially due to his family's connections.
Okay.
So both of them are pieces of shit with stupid defenses, but they're two separate people.
So listen to the anger in your voice and the anger in my voice. I think the hard determinist is saying that we're wrong to feel that. And that's what's really hard to, and so I feel like I should have assigned some video in combination with the Norway thing just to make you feel angry in this way, just to remind you that how much of a revision that the hard determinist is trying to, that I shouldn't be outraged and infuriated. I think being infuriated at people like this, I wouldn't be infuriated at an 8-year-old. I couldn't be infuriated at an 8-year-old. I mean, I'd be frustrated, right? But I can't be infuriated. I can't be outraged like I can be towards Brock Turner and the judge who let him off, right? Like, in fact, I feel like the judge should be not only kicked off fired, but also thrown in jail too for his like ridiculous. So anyway, sorry. But the amount of revision it seems that hard determinism. I've totally lost the thread here. I don't even remember what I was responding to Tema. I don't remember what your point is. I'm like so out. Like I'm so angry right now about Brock Turner.
I was just saying that in a system where we're basically like with a child, you're training them to deal with responsibility. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like so I think that training people up and seeing yourself as being someone who's more responsible than just a small, you're right. I think that like we would have, to me, it seems like hard determinism requires me to give up these attitudes towards Brock Turner, but also to see him as just a permanent child or a permanent, not alligator or dog, like it's somebody who's not truly responsible, who I can't feel outraged at, but also see myself in that way, where I can't take true pride in what I do or see myself as super responsible and not raise children just like into this. Like I would be raising children not to start to see, like you're saying, see themselves as truly responsible, but always as just, yeah. I mean, I think there's something very inhuman about the world in which I feel like the hard determinist is asking us to occupy. Julia, who's going to defend hard determinism, I think, because you were pretty, yeah, okay, good.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a slight wrinkle, which is that I know that I was reading a lot of the comments on the Norway videos, and some people actually from Norway clarified that there are cases where people do not ever get out. That most people, the goal is rehabilitation.
But those are quarantine cases, right? People
those
who
are
never
quarantine,
get out.
But that's the whole idea, is that you don't get out not because the idea is that we're trying to like subject you to hell for the rest of your life, but because we recognize like if you're Hitler or the summer camp shooter or potentially Brock Turner, who has like such a callous disregard for people, that you might never be able to be rehabilitated. But it doesn't mean that we are trying to like do an eye for an eye type thing and make you suffer as much as you made other people suffer. I mean, it does suck in some ways, but I think it kind of asks us to be the bigger person and recognize that recognize that our sense of like happiness and accomplishment in life shouldn't come from external validation, and that we're not responsible for everything that we think we are, neither good nor bad. Like, I think in American society specifically, we have a very like libertarian ideal, American dream, where it's like you fail or you succeed on your own merit. And if you didn't get there, it's because you just didn't try or you just didn't do the thing or whatever. And the more and more we talk about things like, systemic racism or like other societal barriers, or again, like even your own psychological conditioning, the more we realize like no one really goes it alone. Like you don't succeed on your own merit 100% ever. And you likely don't fail or do horrific acts either. So I think maybe it feels uncomfy, but I think it's like a very adult way of viewing the world, where instead of saying, I want a gold star or I want to be mad at that person because they screwed up, it's a realization that all of us are part of, at the risk of sounding really like, crunchy granola, like we're all part of like a greater interconnected tapestry of life. And like, man is not an island, basically.
But what if, so I think that everything you said is true. I just don't think I don't think that the reason it's true is because hard determinism is true, right? Like those are like free will can exist, responsibility can exist, and we should realize that we're not as responsible as we think we are. And like, so I'm not really the only sense I'm disagreeing with you is it's nice that hard determinism suggests that we should lower the sense that we feel that people, this American idea that you make yourself, and we should like recognize systemic racism, and like hard determinism is nice in that it directs our attention towards these other outside factors that are determining how people. I just don't know. I think that that's something we should do anyway. And we can be compatibilists and do that. We don't have to be hard determinists and do that. But
that's fair. I probably didn't make the case well because I am a compatibilist. So it's hard for me to make that leap to hard determinism.
You made the case wonderfully. I think the selling points for hard determinism, when they try to make it sound nice, I'm just like, well, I don't have to be a hard determinist and I can still accept all that stuff. Jackson. Your hand.
Yeah, so I was thinking, again, on Julia's point, you could still make an argument against, I know this is getting off topic, you could argue against restorative justice from the viewpoint of a hard determinist by saying that the threat of punishment or whatever helps keep it is a deterministic factor in keeping people from committing crimes. Obviously, that's getting off topic.
It's not getting off topic. When you get to reading chapter 7, the second half of chapter 7 says, it goes beyond this argument. It says, what if we accept hard determinism? What are the consequences? So one idea is that we have to reform our judicial system, but and maybe we have to reform some of our attitudes towards one another. Like I can't be outraged at people, I have to treat other people. I can't be outraged at an 8-year-old, so I probably can't be outraged at a 30-year-old if I'm a hard determinist. Like our relationships towards each other change, and how we hold each other responsible, and how much pride we take in our own actions. So there are changes in our lives that will happen if we're hard determinists. But the rest of the chapter 7 talks about optimists and pessimists. So the hard determinist optimists are like, not a lot would change. We'd get a better judicial system that's more kind and holds people less responsible. We'd be less angry towards people who are poor and not succeeding. We wouldn't see it as, we would be more understanding. Love would still exist because we love people for dumb. Like I fall in love with someone. It's not like I'm choosing to fall in love. Parents love their kids. It's not a choice. It's something that's it is genetic. It's not like we think that loves any less. So the optimists of the hard and like you said, you can still have a judicial system that punishes people to deter crime, and you can lock people up to quarantine them and keep them from hurting other people, and to reform them, but also just to deter crime, you can do punishment. There is a worry that you would often maybe punish people who haven't done anything just to send a message, because now it's not a matter, like punishment in the judicial system is not a matter of responsibility anymore. It's a matter of setting an example.
Right.
It's not like we don't do that already, though.
The chapter, like literally, the hard determinist does say that in their defense. Like, we already do that anyway.
Like, we only have the highest incarceration rate in the world. We only like throw black men in jail for weed charges. I don't know. I don't buy that. I'm sorry. I'll shut up.
But good. No, you're right. So the rest of the chapter handles that, and I do have to move on to the next chapter because there's some hard stuff. Tema, I want to hear what you have to say. And then I'm going to move on. But I do want to say this chapter handles this Galen Strawson's argument that we've just talked about. And then the second half of the chapter talks about optimistic hard determinists that think that not much will change. And then one hard determinist who's a pessimist who says, oh, a lot would change. It would be terrible. Human life would be completely unrecognizable and miserable, which is why we need to keep this a secret. We need to, like us academics, we can all recognize this, but do not let the public know, right? We need to keep this on the down low. So there is that sort of attitude that, I'm a pessimist about hard determinism. I think a lot would change. It actually does undermine a lot of things. I don't think hard determinism is true, because I think either compatibilism or metaphysical libertarianism can succeed. But if it were true, I think it would be really, really miserable. So I don't know. I guess I'm trying to imagine myself if I believed hard determinism. I probably would be like, yeah, we should probably keep this a secret. Tema.
So one of my fears with hard determinism that Nico kind of touched on in his comment is like there are levels of responsibility that we give to non-humans, you know, like with the alligator, we rarely ever try to like domesticate it in the same way that we domesticate a dog when we try to train it for doing something wrong. So I guess, and in the same way we treat a young child differently than a dog. And I guess my fear is that we, with hard determinism, like at what point do we draw the line so that humans just don't come back all the way to like their primitive state of an alligator? I guess that's my fear with it.
I'm confused. Do you think, so you're right, we do treat dogs differently than alligators, but I could never be outraged or offended by an 8-year-old or a dog in the way I can be outraged or offended or betrayed by a lover, right? Or outraged by Brock. I mean, like there are these attitudes that we only hold towards other human beings. And I think it has to do with the sense in which we think that they're responsible and they're free, that we don't think that an 8-year-old or a dog is. I mean, there is whatever the difference is between an alligator and a dog, I don't think it's a very dramatic one. The one that's really interesting is between all of these attitudes, and we call them, again, reactive attitudes. I don't know why they're called reactive attitudes. I think it's like reaction towards someone's responsibility or their freedom. I have no idea why philosophers call that, where this term came from, but reactive attitudes are the ones that seem to only be appropriate towards fellow human beings who we see as responsible in some way. It's just like such a dramatic difference between the sort of relationships and emotions I can have towards my fellow humans and I can have towards, I mean, I'm never deeply hurt by a dog. I'm annoyed by a dog. That's the best I can muster, right? No, Tema, I'm gonna let you talk.
No, yeah, I completely agree, but I'm just saying, like, if determinism is true, like, at what point do we? I think that there is value in this concept of praise, I guess, and I think that if we bring people to this like primitive idea of like responsibility and praise towards an alligator that doesn't exist, I think that a lot of value is lost. Like it takes away that valuable difference that is between a human and an alligator.
So you're a pessimist. So the chapter divides up hard determinists in between people who are pessimistic about hard determinism, like it would really ruin things, and those who are optimistic about hard determinism, that we could change some things, but actually would be for the good. Great. I need to keep going because I need to get to the next chapter, which is chapter 8, and it is on. I'm gonna stop sharing. On this new form, he calls it new compatibilism. It's not all that new, I guess. It's from Harry Frankfurt. Harry Frankfurt, who got a little famous because he wrote he wrote an essay called On Bullshit a couple of years ago. And it was a book that it was about the difference between telling a lie and saying bullshit, right? So telling a lie is, I recognize the truth, I have a reason for telling a lie, and I'm purposefully saying something false to get something I want. Whereas when you're bullshitting, you're just kind of saying stuff. You don't really pay it. Like you just don't care. So he's sort of talking about the ways in which bullshit is different or worse than lying, because it like has this complete disregard for the line between truth and falsity. But anyway, he's more famous for his work on free will. And he makes this argument for compatibilism. And he says, and it's very similar to an argument from John Locke, which is the one about how you have somebody in a room with a friend and they haven't seen each other in 10 years and they're catching up and they're super excited to see each other and they're talking. And it turns out the room is locked, so they couldn't leave if they wanted to, but they never try the door because they're happy to be together and they want to be in that room. And John Locke's point and Frankfurt's point is that that's staying in that room is something they should be seen responsible for and as a free decision, even though there wasn't an alternative choice for them to make, right? Oftentimes the argument for determinism depends on this idea that determinism means that there's one track on how the universe could unfold. There's no way things could have gone differently. And that undermines the possibility of freedom. And you would need libertarianism, this random chance to like have these bifurcating alternative possibilities where things could switch and your choice makes the difference in order for there to be freedom and responsibility. And Frankfurt wants to say, no, I mean, if you're doing what you would have chosen if you were free, if you're doing what you want, I guess, or what your your values endorse, or what your higher level meta desires endorse, or what your reasons and, like whatever form of compatibilism you want, what your real self endorses, then that's free, even if you didn't have the alternative option, like being locked in the room. Now, Frankfurt talks a lot about a different example, Jones and Black. I'll share my screen, although I don't think I'm going to read off the slides much. Just to have a picture. So Jones and Black. So Black is either an evil scientist, a neuroscientist, a god, a demon, whatever you want. But what Black is doing, I'm sorry, is he's monitoring Jones. So let's say he's a neuroscientist. He's implanted stuff in Jones's brain, and he wants Jones to make a choice for A. So Black wants Jones to pick A, but Jones has a choice between A and B. And what Black is going to do is, if he sees the brain activity of Jones going towards making the choice of A, he's just going to let it happen. But if the brain activity is heading towards Jones picking B, he's going to hit a button, which is going to like send some electrical activity or some chemistry or chemicals or whatever, in order to force Jones to choose A. Because he's going to he's going to determine the fact that Jones is going to pick A, right? But he's only going to intervene to prevent Jones from picking B. If Jones is going to pick A all on his own, he's going to let it happen. So what Frankfurt wants to say is, if Jones picks A all on his own and Black doesn't intervene, then that counts as a free choice, despite the fact Jones couldn't have possibly picked B, because Black would have intervened and stopped the choice, and then determined it. So free choice and responsibility doesn't require having alternative possibilities, doesn't require there being a different option. You could be determined. Jones is determined to pick A, because if he had gone for B, there would have been an intervention and would have stopped him. So he was stuck on the track picking A. Nevertheless, this counts as free according to Frankfurt, because Black just let him choose as he wanted to, completely freely according to Frankfurt. So freedom and responsibility doesn't require an alternative possible choice like the libertarian claims it does. You can be locked into one choice and it still be a free choice and still be a responsible choice. We're kind of running low on time, so I'm going to draw the analogy to determinism real quick, and then I'll open it up to questions. But the claim here is something like, and this is analogous to determinism, right? There is only one track, the compatibilist says. You are determined to do this, this, and this, and this. But sometimes, one way to think about it, it's what you would have chosen anyway. It's the thing that your meta desires endorse. It's what your personality endorses. It's what maybe your reasons and in those cases, it's just like Jones picking what he wanted to pick, like picking without Black intervening. Determinism is locking you into this. Now, if determinism is preventing you from choosing something you wanted to choose, but you can't because so maybe you're handcuffed, or you're a drug addict, like you don't want to sell your child's crib in order to afford the next hit of heroin, but you're so addicted to heroin that you can't resist selling your child's crib to buy the next hit of heroin. That doesn't, like, you are determined to do that, and that's not free, and that's something you're not responsible for because that's not what you would have chosen if you had been free. But in the normal cases, when I choose, I say like, well, I'm gonna go run by the Bosphorus in the park because it's good exercise and I enjoy the weather and I like the sea and I've got some free time and I have all these reasons for making the choice, and it's also what I want to do, and no one's forcing me to do it. There's no addiction that's forcing me to do it. I'm not handcuffed or dragged there. That's kind of like when Jones is picking to do A and Black doesn't intervene. It just lets him make the choice he was going to make anyway. So sometimes your choices are things you would have chosen anyway. Those count as free and responsible, even though determinism doesn't give you the other option. And then there's the times where you're forced to do something you wouldn't have chosen to do, and determinism doesn't give you a choice. And then those are ones that you don't count as free or responsible for. But what Frankfurt is saying is you don't need the two options. You don't need the alternative possibilities. We don't need the bifurcating way the world could have gone that depends on your choice in order for responsibility and freedom to exist. We just need to look at the one track, and we can circle all the options where you were doing what you would have chosen anyway. Those are ones you're responsible and free for. And then we can circle all the ones where you wouldn't have done that had you been free. And those are the ones you're not responsible for, even though it's all one track. Okay, I mean, shut up. And Tema, you have your, are you talking, Tema?
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry, your square is highlighted. So let me shut up. So that's chapter 8, talking about Frankfurt. Thoughts about Frankfurt? Okay, well, we only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to give you, at this point, that's kind of the first part of chapter 8. And then at the second half of chapter 8, is it chapter 8? Yeah. Starting in section 4, it's called Responses to Frankfurt, I think. It gets really hard. It starts talking about some responses to Frankfurt that are just very, very difficult to understand. And so I won't grade you guys. I won't put questions on the next quiz about this, because this is just, and if you cut out, that's fine. If you don't read the rest of this. But let me tell you the one good objection to Frankfurt here that's in this second section. So an objection to this Black and Jones example that someone raises, and they point out, to say, well, if libertarianism was true, then Jones's choice between A and B would be totally undetermined. And so Black wouldn't know how he was going to how Jones was going to choose until Jones chose, right? There would be no brain chemistry that, oh, I can see how he's about to choose A, or he's about to choose B, so now I need to force him to choose A. Like, there wouldn't be that I don't know, the evidence about what choice was about to be made, because it would be libertarian. It would be totally random and free and undetermined. So this example doesn't work to make the case for the compatibilist against the libertarian, because this example would be impossible in a libertarian indeterministic world view of decisions, because there would be no way for the neuroscientist to predict what decision Jones was going to make until after he made it. I don't know exactly what to make of this objection, but if you undermine this example of Jones and Black, then you undermine the analogy to determinism, and then maybe you can undermine Frankfurt's argument for compatibilism. The rest of the chapter goes into a bunch of incredibly difficult, and even in the textbook, he says, like, I can't go into much detail here because this stuff gets really tough and it's too hard for an intro textbook. But some really difficult arguments, including ones from Melee, in defense of Frankfurt and trying to respond to this objection. All of them seem terrible to me. This seems like a pretty good objection. I'm not sure if it actually does undermine Frankfurt's argument, but it's definitely a good objection. I don't know what the fact that Frankfurt's example depends on Black being able to predict Jones' decision before Jones makes it, so he knows whether to intervene or not. And yet in a libertarian world, you wouldn't be able to make those predictions. That makes me worry that this example is circular or begs the question, because it's already assuming he could predict, which would assume that determinism is true. And so then it's assuming that libertarianism is false in order to make the argument that libertarianism is false. I'm not sure. I guess I don't know if this is a good objection or not, but I think it's, I used to be really, really confident that Frankfurt's argument was a great one here. And now I'm a little more concerned because of this objection. Seems, I don't know what to make of it yet. I haven't really quite processed fully what I think of this objection, but it seems like a powerful one. Okay, we only have 2 minutes. I want to shut up and that is all I have for today. Does somebody want to ask a final question, make a final comment, make a final argument? Tell us whether you think Frankfurt's good or not. Come on, I mean, I'm with myself all day. We're all in quarantine. Like, I want to hear somebody else talk.
I thought you were taking jogs along the Bosphorus.
I should take jogs, but I haven't exercised this entire goddamn pandemic. I do need to go do that. It is right down the street, though.
That's really fucking cool.
Yeah, it really is. Not gonna lie, pretty amazing.
I think the argument, I think the what did you just say? The opposition to Frankfurt's case, that actually makes a lot of sense, and I hadn't considered that.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know what to make. Yeah, I need to go talk to my colleagues. This is the sort of thing I'd be like, wow, that's really cool. I'm going to go knock on the doors with all these incredibly smart philosophers who work down the office for me and just ask them what they think of this. But I can't because disease. But yeah, great. All right, well, Julia, you took us out. Thank you for making the final comment. I will see you guys on Tuesday, and I will post the quiz grades and the discussion forum grades this weekend and the prompts for the paper this weekend. And next week, I'll try, maybe not next week, but sometime soon, I'll have a whole lecture or video about writing philosophy papers. So you'll have some advice on how to write those. Great seeing you guys. I'll stick around if anybody has any further questions.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Is it Terrence? Terrence, are you here? No. Okay.